Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. Last words were, well, said Miss Betsy. I kept my housekeeping book regularly and balanced it with Mr. Copperfield every night, cried my mother in another burst of distress and breaking down again. Okay, and by the way, please subscribe to the channel, StudyCoach UK, and please share the channel, share the videos, audio with others, share the stories with others. Please do. Let me continue. Well, said Miss Betsy, don't cry anymore. And I'm sure we never had a word of deference respecting it, except when Mr. Copperfield objected to my 3s and 5s being too much like each other, or to put in curly tails to my 7s and 9s, resumed my mother in another burst, and breaking down again. You'll make yourself ill, said Miss Betsy, and you know that will not be good either for you or for my goddaughter. Come, you mustn't do it. This argument had some share in quieting my mother, though her increase in indisposition had a larger one. There was an interval of silence, only broken by Miss Betsy's occasionally ejaculating, as she sat with her feet upon the fender. David had bought an annuity for himself with his money, I know, said she by and by. What did he do for you? Mr. Copperfield, said my mother, answering with some difficulty. He was so considerate and good as to secure the reversion of a part of it for me. How much? Asked Miss Betsy. £105 a year, said my mother. He might have done worse, said my aunt. The word was appropriate to the moment. My mother was so much worse than Peggotty, coming in with the tea-board and candles and seeing at a glance how ill she was, as Miss Betsy might have done sooner if there had been light enough. Conveyed her upstairs to her own room with all speed, and immediately dispatched Ham Peggotty, her nephew, who had been for some days past secreted in the house, unknown to my mother, as a special messenger in case of emergency to fetch the nurse and doctor. Those allied powers were considerably astonished when they arrived within a few minutes of each other, to find an unknown lady of pretentious appearance sitting before the fire with her bonnet tied over her left arm, stopping her ears with jeweller's cotton. Peggotty knowing nothing about her, and my mother saying nothing about her, she was quite a mystery in the parlour. And the fact of her having a magazine of jewellers, cotton in her pocket, and sticking the article in her ears in that way, did not detract from the solemnity of her presence. The doctor having been upstairs and come down again, and having satisfied himself, I suppose, that there was a probability of this unknown lady and himself having to sit there face to face for some hours, laid himself out to be polite and social. He was the meekest of his sex, the mildest of little men. He sidled in and out of a room to take up the less space. He walked as softly as the ghost in Hamlet and more slowly. He carried his head on one side, partly in modest depreciation of himself, partly in modest propitiation of everybody else. It is nothing to say that he hadn't a word to throw at a dog. He couldn't have thrown a word at a mad dog. He might have offered him one gently, or half a one, or a fragment of one, for he spoke as slowly as he walked. But he wouldn't have been rude to him, and he couldn't have been quick with him for any earthly consideration. Mr. Chiplip, looking mildly at my aunt with his head on one side and making her a little bow, said, in allusion to the jeweller's cotton, as he softly touched his left ear, "Some local irritation, ma'am?" "What?" replied my aunt, pulling the cotton out of one ear like a cork. Mr. Chiplip was so alarmed by her abruptness, as he told my mother afterwards, that it was a mercy he didn't lose his presence of mind. But he repeated sweetly, "Some local irritation, ma'am." "Nonsense," replied my aunt, and corked herself again at one blow. Mr. Chiplip could do nothing after this but sit and look at her feebly as she sat and looked at the fire, until he was called upstairs again. After some quarter of an hour's absence, he returned. "Well," said my aunt, taking the cotton out of the ear nearest to him. "Well, ma'am," returned Mr. Chiplip, We are progressing slowly, ma'am." "Ah, bah," said my aunt, with a perfect shake on the contemptuous interjection, and corked herself as before. Really, as Mr. Chiplip told my mother, he was almost shocked. Speaking in a professional point of view alone, he was almost shocked. But he sat and looked at her, notwithstanding, for nearly 2 hours as she sat looking at the fire, until he was called out. After another absence, he again returned. "Well," said my aunt, taking out the cotton on that side again. "Well, ma'am," returned Mr. Chiplip, We are progressing slowly, ma'am." "Ah," said my aunt, with such a snarl at him that Mr. Chiplip absolutely could not bear it. It was really calculated to break his spirit, he said afterwards. He preferred to go and sit upon the stairs, in the dark and a strong draught, until he was again sent for. Ham Peggotty, who went to the National School and was a very dragon at his catechism, and who may therefore be regarded as a credible witness, reported next day that, happening to peep in at the parlour door an hour after this, he was instantly decried by Miss Betsy, then walking to and fro in a state of agitation, and pounced upon before he could make his escape. That there were now occasional sounds of feet and voices overhead, which he inferred the cotton did not exclude, from the circumstance of his evidently being clutched by the lady as a victim on whom to expend a superabundant agitation when the sounds were loudest. That marching him constantly up and down by the collar, as if he had been taking too much laudanum. She at those times shook him, rumpled his hair, made light of his linen, stopped his ears as if she confounded them with her own, and otherwise tousled and maltreated him. This was in part confirmed by his aunt, who saw him at 12:30, soon after his release, and affirmed that he was then as red as I was. The mild Mr. Chiplip could not possibly bear malice at such a time, if at any time. He sidled into the parlour as soon as he was at liberty, and said to my aunt in his meekest manner, "Well, ma'am, I am happy to congratulate you." "What upon?" said my aunt sharply. Mr. Chiplet was fluttered again by the extreme severity of my aunt's manner, so he made her a little bow and bade her a little smile to mollify her. "Mercy on the man, what's he doing?" cried my aunt impatiently. "Can't he speak?" "Be calm, my dear ma'am," said Chiplet in his softest accents. "There is no longer any occasion for uneasiness, ma'am. Be calm." It has since been considered almost a miracle that my aunt didn't shake him and shake what he had to say out of him. She only shook her own head at him, but in a way that made him quail. "Well, ma'am," resumed Mr. Chiplet, as soon as he had courage, "I am happy to congratulate you. All is now over, ma'am, and well over." During the 5 minutes or so that Mr. Chiplet devoted to the delivery of his oration, my aunt eyed him narrowly. "How is she?" said my aunt, folding her arms with her bonnet still tied on one of them. "Well, ma'am, she will soon be quite comfortable, I hope," returned Mr. Chiplet. "Quite as comfortable as we can expect a young mother to be under these melancholy domestic circumstances. There cannot be any objection to your seeing her presently. It may do her good." "And she? How is she?" said my aunt sharply. Mr. Chiplet laid his head a little more on one side and looked at my aunt like an amiable bird. "The baby," said my aunt. "How is she?" "Ma'am," returned Mr. Chiplet, "I apprehended you had known. It's a boy." My aunt said never a word, but took her bonnet by the strings in the manner of a sling, aimed a blow at Mr. Chiplet's head with it, put it on bent, walked out, and never came back. She vanished like a discontented fairy, or like one of those supernatural beings whom it was popularly supposed I was entitled to see, and never came back any more. No, I lay in my basket, and my mother lay in her bed. But Betsy Trotwood Copperfield was forever in the land of dreams and shadows. The tremendous region whence I had so lately travelled, and the light upon the window of our room shone out upon the earthly bourne of all such travellers, and the mound above the ashes and the dust that once was he, without whom I had never been. The first objects that assume a distinct presence before me as I look far back into the blank of my infancy are my mother with her pretty hair and youthful shape, and Peggotty with no shape at all, and eyes so dark that they seemed to darken their whole neighbourhood in her face, and cheeks and arms, so hard and red that I wonder the bird didn't peck her in preference to apples. I believe I can remember these two at a little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight by stooping down or kneeling on the floor, and I going unsteadily from the one to the other. I have an impression on my mind which I cannot distinguish from actual remembrance of the touch of Peggotty's forefinger as she used to hold it out to me, and of its being roughened by needlework like a pocket nutmeg grater. This may be fancy, though I think the memory of most of us can go farther back into such times than many of us suppose. Just as I believe the power of observation in numbers of very young children to be quite wonderful for its closeness and accuracy. Indeed, I think that most grown men who are remarkable in this respect may with greater propriety be said not to have lost the faculty than to have acquired it, the rather, as I generally observe such men to retain a certain freshness and gentleness and capacity of being pleased, which are also an inheritance they have persevered from their childhood. I might have a misgiving that I am meandering and stopping to say this, but that it brings me to remark that I built these conclusions in part upon my own experience of myself. And if it should appear from anything, I may set down in this narrative that I was a child of close observation, or that as a man I have a strong memory of my childhood. I undoubtedly lay claim to both of these characteristics. Looking back, as I was saying, into the blank of my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves from a confusion of things are my mother and Peggotty. What else do I remember? Let me see. There comes out of the cloud our house, not new to me, but quite familiar in its earliest remembrance. On the ground floor is Peggotty's kitchen, opening into a backyard with a pigeon house on a pole in the centre, without any pigeons in it. A great dog kennel in a corner without any dog, and a quantity of fowls that looked terribly tall to me, walking about in a menacing and ferocious manner. There is one cock who gets upon a post to crow and seems to take particular notice of me as I look at him through the kitchen window, who makes me shiver. He's so fierce. Of the geese outside the side gate who come waddling after me with their long necks stretched out when I go that way, I dream at night, as a man environed by wild beasts might dream of lions. Here is a long passage. What an enormous perspective I make of it, leading from Peggotty's kitchen to the front door. A dark storeroom opens out of it, and that is a place to be run past at night, for I don't know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea chests, when there is nobody in there with a dimly burning light, letting a mouldy air come out of the door, in which there is a smell of soap, pickles, pepper, candles and coffee, all at one whiff. Then there are the two parlours, the parlour in which we sit of an evening, my mother and I and Peggotty. For Peggotty is quite our companion when her work is done and we are alone, and the best parlour where we sit on a Sunday, grandly, but not so comfortably. There is something of a doleful air about that room to me, for Peggotty has told me, I don't know when, but apparently ages ago, about my father's funeral, and the company having their black cloaks put on. One Sunday night, my mother reads to Peggotty and me in there how Lazarus was raised up from the dead, and I am so frightened that they are afterwards obliged to take me out of bed and show me The quiet churchyard out of the bedroom window, with the dead all lying in their graves at rest below the solemn moon. There is nothing half so green that I know anywhere as the grass of that churchyard. Nothing half so shady as its trees, nothing half so quiet as its tombstones. The sheep are feeding there when I kneel up early in the morning in my little bed in the closet within my mother's room to look out at it. And I see the red light shining on the sundial and think within myself, is the sundial glad, I wonder, that it can tell the time again? Here is our pew in the church. What a high-backed pew, with a window near it, out of which a house can be seen, and is seen many times during the morning service by Peggotty, who likes to make herself as sure as she can that it's not been robbed or is not in flames. But though Peggotty's eye wonders, she's much offended if mine does, and frowns to me as I stand upon the seat that I am to look at the clergyman. But I can't always look at him. I know him without that white thing on, and I am afraid of his wondering why I stare so, and perhaps stopping the service to inquire, and what am I to do? It's a dreadful thing to gape, but I must do something. I look at my mother, but she pretends not to see me. I look at a boy in the aisles, and he makes faces at me. I look at the sunlight coming in at the open door through the porch, and there I see a stray sheep. I don't mean a sinner, but mutton, half making up his mind to come into the church. I feel that if I looked at him any longer, I might be tempted to say something out loud, and what would become of me then? I look up at the monumental tablets on the wall and try to think of Mr. Bodgers, late of this parish, and what the feeling of Mrs. Bodgers must have been when affliction sore, long time Mr. Bodgers bore, and physicians were in vain. I wondered whether they called him Mr. Chiplip, and he was in vain, and if so, how he likes to be reminded of it once a week. I look from Mr. Chiplet in his Sunday neckcloth to the pulpit, and think what a good place it would be to play in, and what a castle it would make, with another boy coming up the stairs to attack it, and having the velvet cushion with the tassels thrown down on his head. In time my eyes gradually shut up, and from seeing to hearing the clergyman singing a drowsy song in the heat, I hear nothing until I fall off the seat with a crash and am taken out, more dead than alive, by Peggotty. Join me, please join me. Join me for the next episode of The Life of David Copperfield. Join me for the next video on The Life of David Copperfield. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.